First of all, I'd like to thank Domenico Moro, especially for inviting me to take part in this meeting, and apologise to everybody else that my subject isn't directly related to the topic of the meeting, but it is related. So I'd like to talk about our idea for a world security community of democratic nations. Let me just give you a couple of hints at where I'm coming from. I'm the president of a small coalition for a world security community, 20 to 30 people, which includes Domenico. And I've always been a convinced world federalist. Ever since I can remember, I've thought it's a good idea to build a democratic world federation. In fact, it's obvious. Global problems need global solutions. We're confronted with some critical global challenges which seem to get more serious with every year, headed by climate change, and then the perennial problem of nuclear weapons, and human rights, refugees, overpopulation, ... So we really need some sort of world government to deal with these critical challenges. The present United Nations is far too weak and ineffective, and it's hamstrung by the veto. So the real $64 question is, how do we get there? By the way, everybody can hear me okay, can they? I assume so.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, so the World Federalist Movement has been trying to achieve this objective ever since World War II, driven initially by the problem of, the possible atomic holocaust. So they've been trying for 70 years without success. So it's a major problem. How do we get there? As a scientist, I'm proud to follow in the footsteps of Albert Einstein, who you'll all recognize this quote, said, "In my opinion, the only salvation for civilization and the human race lies in the creation of a world government with security of nations founded upon law." And that's as true as it's ever been, I'm afraid. All right, possible routes. Well, any eventual world federation has to be based on two principles. First, universality has to embrace all nations so that it can deal with global problems. And secondly, democracy, to prevent any possibility of tyranny or autocracy at the global level, which would be a catastrophe. But of course, these aren't compatible aims at present. Not all nations are democratic. So there are two possible routes. One emphasizes universality. So for instance, the World Federalist Movement has always concentrated on reform of the United Nations, which is the universal organization we have at present. And they've had some major successes with the Coalition for International Criminal Court and the Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. But they've never even succeeded in having a Charter Review Conference convened. The second route emphasizes the other principle of democracy. So start from a smaller group, a community of the democracies, and look for the organization to evolve over time and grow, following the example set by Jean Monnet and the European Union. So that sort of idea dates back almost as far as world federalism, back to the well-known book by Clarence Strite in 1939. And there's another movement called the Atlantic Movement, pushing those sort of ideas. So in my opinion, that's an easier route and a more likely route because there's no rigid charter in the way. There's no constitutional barrier, if you like, such as the UN Charter. Now, the question then is, if you go that route, what should be the basis for the initial community? Ideally, it should be economic, as in the EU case, but you know, free trade has just about been done to death. And at the moment, things seem to be going the other way. Nations are looking to become more protectionist. Whereas security is a major issue at present, I mean, largely driven by fear of China, I guess. So a security community seems to be the way to go at the moment. So our proposal is to enlarge and transform NATO into a world security community open to all democratic nations. And the aims would be, it would be big enough and powerful enough to guarantee the security of all its member states. And beyond that, it would function to assist and strengthen peacekeeping, peace-building operations in the outside world in conjunction with the United Nations. So, for instance, initial candidates for membership would be the so-called Quad members in the Asia-Pacific area: Japan, South Korea, Australia, India. NATO already has most of the organs that are required for a community, but it would need to add, for instance, a court as a prototype or embryo of an eventual legal system. An important point is that the community would only intervene outside its territory with sanction from the United Nations Security Council. That's international law at present, so you can't avoid that. And the main point would be that would mean that the community represents no threat to the non-members, and so it should avoid a new Cold War from breaking out. So there are major advantages to this idea. Following Europe again, it allows evolution by stage, by successive treaties, and it would take advantage, if you like, of the current fear of autocracies due to, for instance, the actions of China in the South China Sea. All right, so that's just a brief sketch of the idea. As our convener has mentioned, it looks like Joe Biden is going to win the election in the US, and that's a very hopeful sign. He wrote an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs, the March-April issue, called "Why America Must Lead Again, Rescuing US Foreign Policy After Trump." And a few quotes from that. "I will invite my fellow democratic leaders around the world to put strengthening democracy back on the global agenda. During my first year in office, the United States will organize and host a global summit for democracy to renew the spirit and shared purpose of the nations of the free world. And the summit for democracy will also include civil society organizations from around the world that stand on the front lines of defense of democracy." So this is enormously exciting news from my point of view. It gives us an ideal opportunity to push these sort of ideas. So we'll do our utmost to get involved in this process. If I've got a couple of minutes, I can maybe add one more thing. So a possible agenda at this summit, we should look for that the summit should be repeated yearly and become a World Democracy Summit held every year, basically to function as a council of heads of government. That should be easy to achieve, one would think. Secondly, a new international institution should be set up to support and implement the plans of the heads of government, some sort of world community of democracies. So a commission should be set up to draft a new Treaty of Washington, or whatever the name is, for this purpose, modeled after the Treaty of Rome in Europe. Thirdly, one of the organs of the new community should be some sort of civil assembly which over time might evolve into an elected global parliament, following the example of the European Parliament. Now, just interjecting there, NATO already has a parliamentary assembly, which would do the job. And either the community itself or one of the major institutions of the new community should be a world security community of democratic nations in order to defend against authoritarianism. All right, thank you. That's a rather rushed, but hopefully coherent exposition of our views.